I mean, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. It's kind of really a real privilege to join you. Just to start with, just a little bit about myself. Yeah, just a little bit about myself. So I am the head of research communications at the University of Cambridge. So I came to this route very much through the science communication route. So I started off as a physicist. So I did my degree in physics at Imperial College London. And as part of my degree course, I could do a unit about science communication, which was what I really loved, absolutely loved doing that part, and decided to go down that route as a career. But I had a break of 3 years where I came onto the JET program in Japan. So I taught English in Tochigi Ken before returning to the UK to pursue a career in science communication. I started off at the Science Museum in London, so developing exhibits there, and then moved from that to the British Science Association, which is where I took over from the press officer there when he left. And they run things like National Science Week and what was the British Science Association's Festival of Science in every September, where journalists would come and camp out at the university for the week. We would feed them loads of stories. We used to get, you used to open a newspaper and you would have 2 pages full of stories from the festival, even with a banner at the top of the newspaper saying BA Festival of Science, which was quite something. The picture that you can see there of the researcher with the duck was, this was my very first festival. He had done an experiment to test whether it was true that ducks' quacks don't echo. And he'd done this by putting a duck into an echo chamber, and it was the results were quite astounding. And suffice to say that ducks' quacks do actually echo. I went on from the British Science Association to work for the Wellcome Trust, which is one of the world's largest funders of biomedical research. It's based in London. And that was really where I think I cut my teeth as a press officer and learned a lot more about kind of how to do media relations. I then moved on from the Wellcome Trust to the University of Cambridge, which is where I am now. And for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a very old institution. We're about 800 years old, quite large. We cover the entire spectrum of subjects from the kind of science, technology, engineering, medicine, through to the arts and humanities. We have 121 Nobel Prizes, which means that every October we always get quite a sense of excitement and dread as we watch the Nobel Prize announcements, waiting to see if we've got another one. I have to say it's really exciting if you do get a Nobel Prize, but it takes quite a lot of work to manage that on the day. So my team is part of the Office of External Affairs and Communications. So there's about 50 people in this office in total. And that covers research communications, which is my team, the media team, which is more kind of corporate communications. I always say the difference between our teams is that my team gets to do the kind of good news stories. The media team tends to have to pick up the pieces when students or academics do something stupid. We also have internal communications, our social media team, web and digital, public affairs, public engagement, who run an annual festival in Cambridge, and our brand and design teams. So my team, the research communications team, so there are 8 of us, and we are, as you would guess, responsible for communicating to the outside world about the research that takes place at Cambridge. And we do this through a mixture of media relations. I would say this is the bulk of what we do, working on press releases, pitching them out to the media, trying to get media coverage. We also do, and particularly in recent years, a lot more feature writing, so writing more in-depth pieces about Cambridge research. We work with the social media team to produce films that communicate what we're doing. We do profiles of our researchers, and most recently we started working on priority areas. So we've just launched a campaign about cancer research, which is Cambridge is changing the story of cancer. And this is a mixture of features that we want to try and communicate to key audiences, not necessarily the media, but like policymakers, funders, potential donors, and so on. So what's the point of kind of doing research communications? So I think broadly it breaks down into about kind of three groups. So one of it is about building and maintaining the reputation of the university. It was really interesting. We got a new director of communications about a year ago, or maybe 2 years ago now. Time flies. And he said that when he was being interviewed, the one thing that people kept saying is, "Oh, it's terrible. Cambridge, we only ever get negative coverage about Cambridge University." And he was saying, "Well, I'm sure that's not true because I see really kind of positive stories in the media." And actually, that's what, in a sense, that's partly what we're there for. We're there to kind of put out all these stories about the amazing work that goes on at Cambridge University to try, and partly to kind of try and balance the negative coverage that does occasionally occur. And we also need to demonstrate to our funders, and that includes taxpayers, the value of universities. This is how your money is being spent. This is the incredible research that comes out of it. So the second kind of reason, I think, is the public good, really. So it's, we do incredible work at the university. It's important that we share that knowledge beyond the walls of the university, helping inform public debate. This was particularly important, for example, around COVID, when there was a lot, the public needed a lot of information. They needed experts to talk about the situation. And then lastly, it's about increasing the impact of our research. So we work with our researchers to try and not just get media coverage, but to try and get something beyond the media coverage. And a good example of this with a story I did recently was a researcher works on lupus, which is an autoimmune disease. And they had done a study that showed that patients with lupus often experience hallucinations and nightmares. And we got quite a lot of coverage for the story. And the researcher said that she started to get emails from patients who were saying, "This is brilliant. I've experienced these for years. I've always thought it was just me." It's really reassuring to know that there are other people that experience this too, and it's part of my condition. So in terms of where we get our stories from, I would say probably 80 to 90% of the stories that my team puts out are based on journal publications. So we are, to an extent, we rely on researchers coming to us saying, "Look, I've got this paper coming out in Nature. Can you help me press release it?" But of course, we have thousands of researchers at the university, but we only deal with a small number of them on a day-to-day basis. So really, we have to get out and about meeting researchers, talking to them about what we do, why it's important to work with us, how we can help them. And we also get, so in Cambridge, we have an open access repository. So every time a researcher publishes something, they're supposed to put it in the open access repository. This triggers an email to my team so that we know that these papers are coming out. And sometimes it's too late, the paper is out, but a lot of the time we hear about these in advance, so we can follow up with the researchers and say, "Look, we've seen this. This looks really interesting. Can we work with you?" And then, of course, we get tip sheets from the journals saying publications are coming up. And we also look out on social media as well. If a researcher shares something interesting that we think, "Oh, this would make a good story." In terms of how we select our stories, there's no hard and fast rule, but generally we say to researchers, we need ideally 5 working days notice to turn around the press release, be able to send it out to journalists, be able to pitch it, and so on. We pick stories where Cambridge is the first or the last author, and we always work with other collaborating institutions to make sure that we're not duplicating effort. We tend to focus almost exclusively on peer-reviewed publications, so we rarely do preprints, and certainly not in health and medicine, which is the area that I cover. We only rarely even do conference presentations. We'd much rather wait until it's been through the more rigorous gold standard peer review. We're trying to get coverage in quality national and international media outlets. Now we go quite broad. We don't tend to target specific, trade publications or specific scientific publications. We're after the mainstream media. And this is one of the questions that, when researchers come to us and say, I'd love to get this on the BBC, sometimes you look at their study and you think, this will never get on the BBC. So you kind of have to say to them, have you ever seen this kind of story reported there? And we're looking for, ideally a story that's got strong assets, so good images or video. I'll come to this in a second. We don't tend to cover individual donations unless it's a big strategic donation, say like a big philanthropic grant. And as I said earlier, we started doing these priority areas. So cancer is one of them. So sometimes we'll prioritize stories that fit into a particular campaign. So although the bulk of what we do is through press releases, when you're putting out a press release, it's important that you think, well, what will be useful for the journalists? So as well as the press release, if it's tied to a journal publication, always make sure that you send them the publication with the press release. Stick it in a Dropbox. Just make sure that they've got this for you. From you. Journalists will want to look at the publications. We deal with specialist science and health correspondents at our national media. They will look at the publication and they will want to read it. Obviously, think about, are there other things that can help build up this story as well? Are there good images that go with it? Now, most of my stories are no images that go with it, but sometimes you'll come across something like this story that I did fairly recently about the third thumb, where these researchers have created a prosthetic third thumb. So it's important for something like that you're able to share with them images of it and video. So we sent out a video along with the press release. So far, this has had about 380,000 views, and a lot of that comes from media publications embedding it onto their websites. We also, because I cover health and medicine, I'm trying to do more case studies as well. So I did a story about Crohn's disease recently, and spoke to a boy who's 10 years old about his condition and what it means to him. And that just really helps you flesh out that story. And it means when you're pitching it to the journalists, you've got that human interest angle, which is more likely to make the story, make them more interested in that story. So, like I said, most of what we do is through press releases, and this is something that I know eternally frustrates our director. When he first started in his role, he kept saying, "Oh, press releases don't work," and I kept saying to him, "Well, actually, they do, and that's how we get the majority of our coverage." And I think he's finally come around to understand that actually that is true, that they do work for what we do. But we do occasionally offer exclusives for our stories. It's fairly rare we do this, but it may be that a study has already been published, so we can't embargo it. And we know that means that we stand less chance of getting coverage. So we might pitch it to an individual journalist. It might be something that is niche, or that we know a particular journalist is interested in. So again, we might target at them or their publication. And sometimes you want a bit more control of the story. So there might be something that one journalist will write really well. And so rather than sending the story out generally and getting coverage that is really varied and potentially misinterprets it, actually sometimes it can be better just to go to that one journalist that is going to do a good job of getting this story. So it's about the quality of the story rather than the quantity of it. Also, it may be that your spokespeople are not, there's not much availability. So that if you send this out to everybody and people want to speak to them, you're just going to frustrate the journalists. So actually, if you can do it this way, then the journalist will be able to speak to your researcher. As Tomomi said, it's important to know your journalists as well. Don't end up pitching something that the journalist is not going to be interested in. Do a bit of research, find out who is going to be the best person for this story. What is it that they're interested in? We also occasionally invite journalists along to our institution. So I've got somebody coming next week from The Observer, which is one of our Sunday newspapers. And usually we do this, we line up maybe 3 or 4 people for him to meet, where he can spend maybe an hour talking to them about their work and tease out a story. And this really can pay dividends for us. So the story on the right there was about our Early Cancer Institute that we had actually opened about 2 years ago, but we just got some new funding for it. So we took this journalist along. He met a bunch of the researchers there and got a really nice piece out of it, which honestly, I couldn't have written this story better myself in terms of our key messages in. It had everything that we wanted to get across. So thinking in terms of kind of what you need in your press office, I mean, I'm sure that you'll have these already. But I mean, I'd say I was astounded by Tomomi's contact database, knowing 1,000 journalists. I know nowhere near that many. We tend to use, I mean, I do know kind of all the people in my area, but a much kind of narrower group than that. So it's important for us to have a database that we can go to when we're looking up subjects that are outside our area, for example, or to look for new journalists in a particular area. We also use media monitoring to track the coverage that we got. This is really useful for us for when we then report back to our researchers to say, look, here's the coverage that you got. It really impresses them if you can kind of pull off a spreadsheet with several hundred kind of pieces of international media coverage. We use Eureka Alerts, and I'm sure all of you use that too. To be honest, this is probably our #1 best tool, certainly the kind of best value tool that we use in our office. It's our way of reaching kind of international correspondence. We also use a software platform called Shorthand. So we use this for telling our longer form stories, so our feature stories, because our website just can't represent features very well. So we use this plugin instead. And lastly, I put there ChatGPT. Now, there's a question mark on that because there are questions about should we be using this and how should we be using it? It's something that we've started to explore in our office recently, and we have actually developed a series of guidelines for our use. And one of them says, for example, that we would never publish something that is 100% created using ChatGPT. What we don't want to do is people end up writing press releases using ChatGPT. Now, we don't want to take away our skills. We want to use it for, I mean, I use ChatGPT to help explain things to me. If there's a concept like Mendelian randomization that I don't understand, I'll get ChatGPT to explain it to me, but I would never get it to write a press release. And then lastly, in terms of how we kind of measure and report what we do. So like I said, we use media monitoring tools to pick up our coverage and to show the kind of the global reach of what we're doing and to pull off these individual tailored reports for researchers. They are, I mean, I take some of the metrics on that with a pinch of salt. So we've been debating in our team, for example, about should we be reporting reach? Which is one of the things that the media monitoring shows. My view on that is no, we shouldn't. Because if any of you have used media monitoring tools, you'll know that reach basically is the theoretical number of people that might have read this article. So like when you look at something that's been on the BBC, for example, the reach of it will be several million. And it just assumes that everybody that's been to the BBC website has read your story, which unfortunately we know is not going to be the case. And so I don't think we should be using unhelpful metrics like that. And we always feed back to our academics about the media coverage. So here are the kind of key pieces where it's being picked up, plus the kind of the link to the complete list. Also flagging up stories that we think they'll be particularly interested in, ones that covered the story particularly well, or perhaps not, where it's not such a great piece. We have a daily internal newsletter that goes quite broad now. It started for senior leaders, but it's now heads of departments, heads of schools, other communications people in departments. And it's our way of showing to them, this is the amazing kind of coverage that we're getting for these stories. And actually, this partly came out of our director's desire to counter this view that we only got negative coverage of the university. We can show them that, look, we're getting fantastic coverage for our stories. And we also do terminal reports for senior leaders. These are really important because it's a chance for us to reflect back on the stories too. So in these ones, we don't just talk about the coverage, but we talk about the impact of the coverage. So we like to go back to our researchers, a month, 2 months after we've worked with them and say, look, we did this story with you. Did it lead to any interesting outcomes? And that's when you start to hear the anecdotal evidence of, oh yeah, an industrial partner got in touch with me, and they're now collaborating to develop a drug from this molecule that we've developed, or other kind of interesting outputs. But yeah, so that gives us that chance to then show our senior leaders this is the value of what we're doing. And so that in a nutshell is what we do. I realize I've just kind of whizzed through, but I'm happy to take any questions.